What happens when you take a really complex set of beliefs, a whole theological framework, and you run it through the cold, hard rules of formal logic? Well, you get a fascinating kind of intellectual stress test, and that's exactly what we're going to dig into today.
So this is really the core question, isn't it? We're going to follow an analysis that applies pure deductive reasoning to a set of theological beliefs to see if they hold up. Now, just so we're on the same page, think of this less as a commentary on faith and way more as an exercise in pure logic and reason.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start by laying out the foundational metaphysical model described in the source material. Then we'll pull out 6 core propositions from that model. And from there, we'll see exactly how a logical contradiction is supposedly found, and more importantly, what that could mean for the whole system.
All right, first things first, to really get what the source's argument is trying to do, we have to understand the blueprint it's working from. So let's just lay out the core Latter-day Saint concepts of the Godhead and creation as neutrally as we can.
So, first up is the LDS Godhead. As you can see, it's made up of 3 totally separate and distinct beings. Now, the really key distinction here from, say, the traditional Trinity isn't just that they're separate, but it's how they're unified. It's a perfect unity of purpose and will, not a unity of a single shared substance. Now, this scripture right here, it highlights an absolutely crucial point. It really emphasizes the physical, embodied, tangible nature of God the Father and Jesus Christ. This is a massive departure from the idea of a purely spiritual, immaterial God you find in a lot of traditional theism. And it's a key premise for the logic that we're about to see.
Okay, there are 2 other big ideas we have to get our heads around for this model to make sense. First, this idea of eternal intelligences. This basically says that our fundamental consciousness, the core of who we are, was never created, it's always existed. And second, that creation itself wasn't an act of making something from nothing, ex nihilo, but it was more like an act of organizing eternal, pre-existing materials and intelligences. Okay, so now let's see how this whole framework gets broken down for analysis. The source material essentially boils this entire model down to 6 foundational propositions. You can think of them as the core axioms of the system that's about to be tested.
And here they are, the 6 building blocks. You can almost see the train of thought here, right? It flows from eternal minds and God being an organizer to this idea that both God and humanity are on a path of eternal progression. And then those last 2 propositions nail down God's role as the source of an eternal, universal truth. These 6 points are everything for the logical test that comes next.
All right, so with that foundation laid, the analysis now starts to apply the rules of logical deduction to see what necessarily follows from these propositions. And this is the turning point, where the source claims to find a really critical inconsistency, a crack in the foundation.
Let's walk through the logic here step by step. First, if both God and humans are eternal intelligences that can progress, well, then they have to be the same kind of being, just at different stages of development. Second, if God progressed by following eternal, universal truths, that must mean those truths exist independently of him. He didn't invent the rules of the game, he mastered them. And this leads the analysis to a pretty powerful conclusion. God cannot be the ultimate source of a truth that existed before him.
And boom! There it is. This is the direct result. We started with the proposition that God is the source of truth. But the logical steps we just walked through lead us to the exact opposite conclusion, that God is not the source of truth. The system now demands that we believe 2 opposite statements are true at the very same time, and in the world of formal logic, that's a catastrophic problem.
So, what happens when a logical system has a direct contradiction baked into it? Well, this is where things get kinda wild. Classical logic has a name for this, and it's called the principle of explosion.
That Latin phrase, ex contradictione sequitur qualibet, basically means from a contradiction, anything follows. Now, it sounds a little nuts, I know, but it's a fundamental rule of logic. It says that once you accept that a statement and its opposite are both true at the same time, the entire system just breaks down. It completely loses its ability to tell the difference between what's true and what's false.
Just think about that for a second. It's a simple idea, but it's devastating. If you allow just one contradiction, you've essentially broken the rules of logic itself.
The source uses this slightly silly example to show just how absurd the consequences are. If you accept that a ball is both all red and not all red at the same time, you can actually use the formal rules of logic to prove that elephants can fly. The point is, the system just loses all meaning and becomes completely useless for finding truth. So, this brings us to the final part of the sources analysis, the ultimate fallout from this logical collapse. What does this all mean for the system's ability to be a reliable source of knowledge or truth?
The analysis uses a classic logical tool here called reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity. The strategy is pretty simple. If you can show that a set of beliefs ultimately leads to a completely absurd or contradictory conclusion, like something being both true and not true, then you've shown that the initial beliefs themselves must be logically flawed.
According to this analysis, the contradiction forces the system down a specific path, the path of what's called epistemological relativism. Without an ultimate objective source of truth, reality itself can become subjective. I mean, if even God is just discovering truth rather than being the source of it, then who's the final judge of what is universally real?
So how do you fix this apparent contradiction? Well, the source material we're looking at proposes an alternative framework, classical theism. In this model, God is the uncreated creator who made all things ex nihilo, from nothing. Because he's the absolute origin of all reality, including truth itself, the contradiction of being subject to some higher pre-existing law is completely avoided.
And so this logical stress test leaves us right here, with this really challenging final question. If the foundational beliefs of any system, whether it's philosophical, scientific, or theological, lead to a direct contradiction, then what, within that system, can you really trust? It's a question that cuts right to the heart of how we think about reason, belief, and truth itself.